Good evening and welcome to the pre-meeting of the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. At our pre-meeting, we have offered to a number of historical societies, libraries, other roundtables, the opportunity to speak for 8 minutes. Rich Jankowski, who was on, gave his 8-minute representation for Old Baldy. Mayor Jean Marie Embler spoke on behalf of the Parsippany Library. I'm just trying to think who else is on here. And Paul Ives from Milwaukee, treasurer, is going to speak next month. And if anybody else is watching comes on and you want the opportunity for that 8 minutes, just let me know. Mike Campbell is from the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable. And before he starts, Andy Waskey, who portrays General Meade, and we've had him as a speaker, he said he was one of the founders of the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable. And when they rededicated, rededicated one of the monuments, I guess, in Doylestown, he wrote the inscription for it. Mike, you're on.
All right. Thank you very much, Rich. Thank you very much, Henry, and thank you all for signing on early to listen to me. I am Mike Campbell. I am the president of the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable. If you look down here, the left part of the screen, you can see a picture of most of our board at the Spangler Farm and Field Hospital out in Gettysburg this past summer. Picture here in the center is our museum at the height of winter, right at the corner of Broad and Garden Alley in Doylestown. And on the right, you'll see our sign. We are open Saturdays to the public, free of charge. And we are always open by appointment if you just reach out to us over our email, or I'm sorry, our website here. We were founded in 1993. One of the things that is unique about us, Andy could tell you this, is that we have a strong local connection. So people from the Bucks County Historical Society, which you guys probably know as Mercer Museum, from the Doylestown Historical Society got together and started a Civil War group. In 2003, after we received an endowment, our library and museum was established. And because of this, we like to think of ourselves as the center of Civil War history in Bucks County. And we're very proud that in 2021, we won the Best Museum in Doylestown Award. We're only about a town of 10,000. So pound for pound, person for person, I think we have about as good museums as anywhere in the country. Here's where Bucks County is in Pennsylvania.
Transferring class to class.
We're nestled just above Philadelphia. Our most famous son was James. He kind of described us as a kinder, gentler version of Philadelphia, if that helps. We are right here in Doylestown, the center of Bucks County, the county seat. Of course, Bucks County is known for Washington's Crossing, which has a very interesting Civil War connection. If I have time, I'll mention it. We're going to go around the county and talk about some of our projects first, starting in New Hope. And specifically, we were called on to investigate the possibility of Black Civil War veterans buried on private land in New Hope. Most of you probably know this, but there's legislation in both houses of Congress. There's legislation in most state houses dealing with the preservation of Black cemeteries, historic Black areas that have been sort of poorly taken care of over the years. So we worked with a local historian to put together a site map, trying to figure out where the church was, if we can locate the property. And indeed, we found about 1.5 acre cemetery with maybe as many as 150 people buried in it. Luckily, like I said, we have a strong local connection. So the local commander of the American Legion is one of our tour guides. We were able to get up there and find the veterans, make sure the GAR markers were in the right location, and get fresh flags on the sites. But you can see picture on the right how rudimentary this graveyard really is. And then we teamed up with a local Boy Scout troop and all these societies you have listed here on the left to get a property overview done. We approached the homeowners, and the Boy Scouts are going to take care of the property until it can get sorted out in terms of what kind of government involvement the property owners are comfortable with. Next stop in our county tour is Doylestown. Doylestown Arts Fest is a huge street fair Doylestown puts on every year. I'm just going to show you some quick pictures of them. For whatever reason, most of our Confederates come from New Jersey. We do have Union reenactors, but I think you guys might recognize some of these people, so feel free to shout them out in the comments if you recognize anybody. I'm just going to scroll through. The Libby Prison Minstrels made their debut for us last year. They were a smash hit. They'll be back. Our Ladies Aid Society. And all manners of reenactor. And our program director, Jerry Mayers, might be familiar to some of you up there as well. Halloween, we do haunted cemetery tours of Doylestown Cemetery. And we team up with the James Laura Memorial House, which is a historic Victorian home in Doylestown, to do what we did as a haunted field hospital this year, replete with Dr. Sawbones, weeping widows, and the ghost of Mother Mary Bickerdike. That was a lot of fun. Our relationship with the Bucks County Historical Society, I mentioned them earlier. Most people on this call would probably know them just as Mercer Museum. Comes through this guy. This is William Watts Hart Davis. He was the commander of the militia in Bucks County before the Civil War. He is at the center of the Civil War generation, commanded the local regiment. He is also, after the war, the founder of the Bucks County Historical Society. And this is a good example of what we do. So sometime around the turn of the 20th century, all the important men in Doylestown started to get their painting done with these Turkish fez sort of things on their heads. And nobody's been able to figure out how that went about, how that happened. So they asked us, and we haven't been able to figure it out either, quite frankly. Here's another example of what we do. So this little contraption was used to amputate the hand of W.W.H. Davis. His fingers were blown off by a shell in James Island, the summer of 1864. It's made from a cracker box, some suspenders, and a pillow. Nobody over there has really been able to figure out. Again, these organizations don't have people that just do the Civil War on staff, so they call us in. This is me kind of just pondering it over. But we were able to put forward a couple of different theories, one of which looks very promising as an explanation for how that device was used to amputate his fingers. The flag of the 104th, we found in their archives a record from the Battle of Fair Oaks, which is the big battle that took place with Bucks County troops, the number of bullet holes that went through the regimental flag. So we compared that to this flag, which supposedly is the only regimental flag aside from the state flag. And we're trying to figure out how many bullet holes are in this one. Could there possibly have been two regimental flags? Again, just an example of the kind of specialty work we can offer. And of course, the rescue of the colors, commissioned by John Wanamaker in the late 19th century by the Bucks County artist William Trego. A picture of the Battle of Fair Oaks. I'm sure you guys have seen it one place or another if you studied Fair Oaks. This is the original painting. You can see the size of it. In our museum, William Trego did a number of sketches, which he would submit to Davis for approval. And you see here at the top, sketch number 1. So sketch number 1 that William Trego did sits in our museum. Here's another example that about 100 years ago, a guy associated with the 115th Pennsylvania collected GAR ribbons, and he just dumped them onto the Bucks County Historical Society. So they call us in when they can't figure out who these people are. So this is our latest mystery man. We don't know if he was in the 115th. We don't know if he was in a Philadelphia regiment. So if anybody is on from Philadelphia or is an expert in the 115th, please reach out to us if you have any idea who this man is. And it's not Colonel Patterson. 1863 lithograph, Batchelder map of the battlefield of Gettysburg. We recently had this restored with the help of some grant money. It sits in our museum. There's a pennant from the 1913 reunion right underneath that. The latest addition to our collection, an 1864 lithograph of Satterlee Field Hospital in West Philadelphia. It's a gift of one of our members on loan. And wrapping up here, our courtyard, which really was not in great shape. We had a big stump sitting in the middle of it. We took some grant money and we were able to get it all fixed up. So now all those sorts of activities I just mentioned, we'll be able to host at the museum. So if you're going to come down to see us, please do. All these different organizations are available to cooperate and to give you the best time possible in Bucks County. In fact, if you're into the Revolutionary War, the Mercer Museum will be doing a huge exhibit on the Doane Gang next year, if you know anything about the Revolution in West Jersey and Bucks County. So come see us to see the Civil War and go down there to see the Revolution. And a great time would be on Memorial Day. And that's all I got, guys. I don't know if how I did on time.
Mike, that was great. You're completely on time. So, and then in fact, if you want to go a little bit longer, that's fine. We're just waiting for.
All right, I'll tell you this story real quick. So Washington's Crossing, the preservation of the park was spearheaded by two Civil War veterans, one of which was W.W.H. Davis. I showed you his picture. President of the Bucks County Historical Society. He spearheaded it on the western bank. And a guy named William Stryker, who some of you people might know in New Jersey, who was Adjutant General of New Jersey. The interesting thing about this is that Stryker and Davis met July 9th, 1863, aboard Quincy Gilmore's command vessel in the Stono River of South Carolina, ultimately at the planning meeting for what would become the first and second battle of Fort Wagner and the famous charge of the 54th Massachusetts. So Davis was commander of the brigade. He was a colonel. Stryker was a junior aide de camp. And it was the start of a lifelong friendship at the beginning of a momentous campaign.
That's great. Hey, I don't know if you noticed, Mike, but in the chat, Dot Wright mentions on behalf of the
Yes.
Davis Circle.
Yes, they donated not only a replica flag, which is downstairs, unfortunately, I don't think I'll have time to run and get it, a replica flag, the state flag that Curtin would have given them on October of 1861. They also gave us a hometown hero. Sometimes you see them around Pennsylvania, the big thing that hang from the street lights. For whatever reason, Doylestown doesn't let you put them up in the borough. So they gave it to us and we hang it at the museum when we're open. But they're very good friends with us. Dorothy, please reach out to us. We have a lot of fun stuff coming up this summer that we want to include you guys in.
Henry, I don't have Jennifer Murray's phone number. I have her zip code. That's about it.
Okay.
We got a problem. She said that she was passing from one class to another, but even so, she was going to try to get on. Oh boy, that's not good. We got a nice, so far we have a nice audience coming on. We're at 181. I'll tell you what, let me give a promo for our group for at least, we'll save it before the minute starts. We've been our roundtable has been in existence for about 20 years. Let me pass, I'm not going to tell you who we are. You all have the same things that we have, but let me tell you some of the unique things that we have. We are offering this program to our public libraries or any public library who wants to carry it. We give them the link. But we're doing this as a public service. It dawned on me during COVID that my local library had no programs, or really no programs, or very few programs. So I walked in, I offered them the program, and I think they were selling, I think that most of the libraries think we're selling car warranties. And I said, if I gave you money, would you take it? They said, yeah. I said, well, how about taking a program? And with that, we don't want their link. If any other libraries are listening, we don't want their link. Rather, we don't want their address. The people respond directly to the library, and the library supplies the link to our organization. We are funding our group, so we're not asking, we're not a fundraising organization. We don't want it. The only thing we derive from is only by dues. So there's nothing out there that we're asking for anything. But it's also worked out very well for us. I'm still waiting for her. I'll stall some more time. One of the things we participate in, all states have this, is called History Day. It's New Jersey History Day, but a Google History Day. About 500,000 students all over the country participate in a competition. They get a topic. One year it was turning points in history, compromise, and whatever the topic is. They could do either an essay, a performance, a documentary, a website, or an exhibit. And then the winners go on to the University of Maryland. This bigger states especially have regionals, but this got very popular in New Jersey now. So they have it in 3 regionals. But obviously with a large state geographically, they have to have regionals. So what we do at our roundtable, because we're fairly close, we give our prizes out at the finals. Rich Jankowski is down in Camden, and he gives it out at the semifinals through that. But it's also great publicity for the organization, and you're performing part of your mission of education. And then what we do, if the students are local, we bring them to our meeting, and they tell us about the program. And in all due respect, one year we had the young woman, really young girl spoke and got a sustained applause, so much so that I had to apologize to the speaker. It was like the opening act is better than you were. And people have said to me, Rich, we ought to have just the students without the program through that. So that's one of the things we did. And I encourage you to do it in your state. These are the kids you don't hear about. You hear about the kids who score points, but you don't hear about the kids these are the kids that are going on. And it looks excellent on a college application, as opposed to serve coffee at the whatever, or serve lemonade. But on
Rich, Jennifer is joining in just a minute.
Okay, then I'll end it. I'll introduce.
No, you can keep on talking.
Yeah, okay, but I had a strong point. It's an excellent point for your organization. It's what we're all about, and it's education, and we're bringing the kids in. And let me tell you something, these kids do websites and they do documentaries like you don't believe. It's like you watch it on television. And matter of fact, some of the teachers now know me, and one of them says, "Rich, we have a documentary. We'd like you to look at it." And I share it with our members. Oh, John Bamberl just came on. He's from the Congress of Civil War Roundtables. And when Professor Murray gets on, I'll do the introduction for her. Okay.
Yep, she's on right now, and Jennifer, I just made you co-host. Hopefully you see that.
Okay. Tell me when you're ready, I'll introduce.
I just wanted to remind everybody during the presentation, please hold your questions until the end and/or put them in chat. If you're not speaking, and hopefully no one is speaking while Professor Murray is speaking, please keep yourself on mute or I will be muting you. So with that, Rich.
Okay. Welcome. We've already crossed the 105 line. Again, this is a series that is well received, and without any embarrassment on my part, when you hear Jennifer Murray, Professor Murray speak, you'll know why I'm
Rich, you're on mute.
Great characters for 600.
Let me see if I can unmute the people. Hold on. Should be able to. Okay. Okay, Professor Murray, you're good. You're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Should go ahead and start.
Yep, go ahead. We were up to 113 people, as you could probably see. So good audience for you.
Great. Thank you for having me, everybody. I see some familiar faces from our Zoom meeting in January. I'm actually joining you tonight from San Diego. I'm at a conference. The Society for Military Historians meets once a year, and we're meeting this weekend in San Diego, and today's the first day of the conference kicking off. So I hear that it never rains in Southern California, but it is raining in San Diego today. So alas, but it'll be a good conference, a lot of good Civil War stuff on the program too. But tonight, I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint slides, so I'll toggle over and screen share. Okay, I think y'all can see my PowerPoint slide. Tonight, we're continuing the winner of George Meade, I think that we're calling it. I met with you all in January, and then I think last month in February, Jeff Hunt talked with you about some of the fall campaigns in Virginia in 1863. And we're going to continue that narrative tonight by moving into George Meade and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. So I've got about 50 some slides. You're pretty familiar with my presentation style from January. And I want to talk with you about what Meade experiences in the winter of 1864 when he is called before Congress to testify to the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. This is one of the chapters in my Meade book. I was not 100% sure what all this testimony would reveal when I started researching for this chapter, but I hope, at least by the presentation tonight, you'll find this a pretty compelling part of Meade's tenure as commander of the Army of the Potomac, and really underscores just how politically volatile the Army of the Potomac is, particularly, but also the nature of the American Civil War, specifically a democracy fighting a civil war. So before we jump into the Joint Committee specifically, I want to start with a couple background comments, a few kind of framing issues to get us intellectually situated for Meade's testimony. You all heard me, or at least I know some of you did, were with me in January when I talked about the Army of the Potomac and the pursuit from Gettysburg. So hopefully you have that in your mind. You doubled up then with Jeff Hunt, and you have a little bit of a sense of what the fall of 1863 was like for the Army of the Potomac and for George Meade. But I'll make it just a kind of a general point here to springboard us to the Joint Committee. The months following the Gettysburg Campaign offered General Meade his first opportunity to really plan independent operations. And this will see a lot of maneuvering back and forth across the Rappahannock and the Rapidan, leading to some fighting at places like Bristow Station or the aborted Mine Run campaign in late November 1863. This is a pretty volatile period for Meade. Personally, he's really dissatisfied with the nature of the war and kind of the meddling that he's getting from Washington, D.C. He will offer to resign numerous times in the fall of 1863. And it's a period for Meade that really amplifies this discord between the Lincoln administration and the Army of the Potomac and how he thinks that the war should be conducted. So I tell you that just to give you a very quick one slide kind of background that gets us thinking about Meade's situation in the final months of 1863, transitioning to 1864. One thing that Meade's going to get involved in the fall of 1863, aside from these campaigns in Central Virginia, is a little known incident called the McClellan Testimonial. If some of you maybe are familiar to this, or some might not be, this is in September of 1863. The Army of the Potomac takes up a collection, a testimonial for George McClellan, intended, or at least speculated, a monetary donation that will be used to promote or support McClellan's 1864 presidential bid. And George Meade will support this political campaigning, and he in fact will donate $20 to the McClellan Testimonial. And different units throughout the Army of the Potomac will raise a tremendous amount of money to turn around and give to McClellan. This is going to generate some discord within the ranks, particularly among some Republicans, junior officers and senior officers. And the word of the Army of the Potomac, Meade included, and the men within, raising money for the presumed Democratic candidate for the 1864 election is going to make its way to Washington, D.C. And Meade is going to be called to Washington to sort of explain what this testimonial is. And he's going to be sent back down to his army in order to squash it. And the money that some soldiers donated to the testimonial will be refunded. One soldier calls this a shameful electioneering subterfuge, and Salmon P. Chase calls it an insult to the president. Why I'm telling you this is because this is September 1863. This is a moment that reflects poorly on Meade. He has miscalculated in endorsing the testimonial, and it looks like he's supporting the presumed Democratic candidate for the 64 election, George B. McClellan, who has been a long-standing target, a popular target for the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. This committee is established in mid-December 1861. You might be familiar with this. Established initially to look into federal defeats on the battlefield, such as Ball's Bluff. And you can read the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, the testimonies, and this is where I do a lot of the primary research for the Meade testimony here in the winter of 63 and 64 in their published reports. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War investigates any number of topics. Of course, we're going to talk about Meade here tonight, but they will investigate Ball's Bluff, like I mentioned. They will investigate West Point, essentially is looked at as being an incubator for these conservative Democratic tendencies. The chairman of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of War, Benjamin Wade, says if there had been no West Point Military Academy, there would have been no rebellion. They will investigate people like John Porter, the man here on the PowerPoint, Ball's Bluff, as I mentioned, also shown in the PowerPoint, and they will scrutinize military officers, primarily men in the Army of the Potomac, for their conservative, democratic political allegiances. A popular figure for the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War is George McClellan. Of course, McClellan and the Army of the Potomac, perhaps the most volatile army, politically volatile army in American military history. And the Army of the Potomac has slowly excised the ghost of McClellan, but McClellan still very much casts a shadow over the Army of the Potomac, and his conciliatory philosophy of war, very much at odds with some of the more Republican leaning or radical progressive officers within that army. People like Abner Doubleday, who's going to play a prominent role in Meade's testimony, Oliver Otis Howard, and Carl Schurz. These are men who will promote this idea that the Army of the Potomac is wrapped into what they call pro-slavery cliques. They don't explicitly state as much, but they very much hint that people like George Meade are ambivalent, close to calling them a traitor to the Union by not embracing more radical Republican ideologies. So the Joint Committee has been busy by the time they turn to investigate Meade. They have been busy by the time they get to investigating Meade and his leadership in the Army of the Potomac. Meade's going to be investigated in the winter of 1863, 1864. It's going to be the 38th Congress that will do the investigation of Meade, and it will consist of 7 members. Now, not all 7 members are going to be at each of these hearings. Sometimes only 1 member will be there, sometimes 2 or sometimes 3. And by and large, the committee is dominated by Republicans. And there are 2 particularly who will be antagonistic or have a fair amount of animus towards General Meade. One is the senator that we're looking at here, Benjamin Wade from Ohio, and the other one is Senator Zachariah Chandler, who I'll show you on the next slide. Meade, by and large, will have some allies on the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in the way of a Democrat from New York, Moses Adele, and a Republican from Massachusetts, Daniel Gooch, and a Republican senator from Illinois, Benjamin Harding. So there are some members of the committee who were, Meade says, friendly, sympathetic to Meade's position, but the 2 most prominent members on the committee, Zachariah Chandler and Benjamin Wade, very much are antagonistic to Meade. And I wanted to mention Chandler with a quick background comment. Zachariah Chandler and Meade's relationship predates this investigation here in 1863 and 1864. When the Civil War began, George Meade is in Detroit, Michigan. He's a captain in April of 1861, working on the topographical engineers, doing some survey work out at the Great Lakes. And he's watching the secession crisis unfold from Detroit, firing on Fort Sumter, subsequent battle at First Bull Run. Meade is in Detroit. And Zachariah Chandler will mandate, the senator from Michigan, he will mandate that all regular Army officers serving in his state, Michigan, take another loyalty oath. And Meade refuses. This is April of 1861. Meade refuses to publicly take another oath to the Union, a loyalty oath, stating that a politician such as Zachariah Chandler cannot command or demand that he or any other officer in the federal army take a loyalty oath. And that gets Chandler's ire. Chandler will target Meade, speculating that his refusal underlies disloyalty or sentiments that are disloyal. And here now in 1863 and 1864, Chandler has an opportunity to use the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War as a platform to expose Meade's disloyalty or certainly his mediocrity as a general. Now, some people certainly look at Chandler and recognize his motives for what they are. This is the Detroit Free Press that I'm quoting here on March 6th, saying that the same astute military senators who sit in the Senate, they read speeches to empty benches, are brave in words only and resort to all sorts of innuendos to weaken popular confidence in any man. Very much the Detroit Free Press is a pro-Meade newspaper, and they see Chandler's motives as being purely political. So what the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War is investigating, they're going to look at Meade's leadership from the Gettysburg Campaign through to the Mine Run Campaign. Most of the questions and most of the testimony that the congressmen are going to hear center on Gettysburg. And if y'all read through the congressional reports and you look into these testimonies, you'll see that basically the arguments can be distilled to two big points. One big point is that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. That's accusation number one, that he had no intention to fight there. And people who will push this argument, and we'll see this in my next couple slides, will point to the Pipe Creek Circular as evidence that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. And they will point to the July 2nd Council of War as evidence that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. Then the second big topic or accusation that comes out in the testimonies is that Meade failed to pursue from Gettysburg. His pursuit was lethargic, and he had the opportunity to deliver a decisive, crushing blow along the banks of the Potomac River there in mid-July 1863, and he failed to do so. So all the people that are going to be traipsed into DC through these winter months essentially are getting at these 2 points. Now, I'd like you to think about something, maybe an obvious point, but we'll make it here. Meade is defending victory. The Congressional Committee is investigating a general who won the Battle of Gettysburg. And I can't think of any other moment in American military history where an American general is forced to such an extent to defend his success. And that's the position that Meade finds himself in here in late 63, early 64. So we might ask then, what does the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War want? What do they want to get out of this? You all know how this story ends. Even if you don't know a lot of the details of the testimonies themselves, you know that Meade is not going to be relieved of command. But what the committee wants, their objective, gold standard, is to compile enough evidence from these generals to show a compelling case that Meade is unfit to command the Army of the Potomac. And if they can prove that, they're going to ask Lincoln to reinstate Joe Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Now, that should give us some pause, that the committee's intention is to replace a winning general, Meade, with Hooker, who lost at Chancellorsville. It's antithetical. And it might seem bizarre in 2023 to even consider this notion, but let me suggest this. If you think about Hooker's career, yes, of course, he's relieved of command, or he resigns on June 28th, 1863, but Lincoln is not completely done with Hooker. Lincoln will ask Meade if he would take Hooker as a corps commander and install him as a corps commander. Meade ultimately says no when he realizes he has a choice in the matter. And then Lincoln is going to have to find something to do with Hooker. So Joseph Hooker will take the Army's 11th and 12th Corps and be sent west. So there's this moment in 63 where it looks like Hooker's star might be on the rise again. So what these testimonies are intended to do, and you'll see this when we walk through a couple of them, in part is to rehabilitate Hooker's reputation. And if you're going to rehabilitate Joseph Hooker's reputation, you have to weaken Meade's, or you have to tear down Meade in order to rehabilitate Hooker. And all this is so carefully orchestrated. It is so carefully orchestrated. 15 generals will testify between February and April 1864. So this is the time that the Army of the Potomac is sitting in central Virginia. 15 generals, not including Meade. And I've got them organized on my PowerPoint slide, generally speaking, as generals who are favorable to Meade and generals who are not. And the group that are not, the ones that are really critical of Meade and his leadership, probably no surprise, consists of Dan Sickles, Abner Doubleday, Albion Howe, Alfred Pleasanton, David Bell Birney, Dan Butterfield, Meade's chief of staff, and James Wadsworth. Generals who testify before Congress, who by and large are favorable, give favorable accounts of Meade's leadership: Gouverneur K. Warren, John Gibbon, Henry Hunt, Samuel Crawford, Seth Williams, John Sedgwick, Andrew Humphreys, and Winfield Scott Hancock. I want to share with you how the testimony starts. We're not going to go through all 15 of these. I want to work through it a little bit more thematically. But the testimony kicks off with Dan Sickles. The first person to testify to the Joint Committee on Conduct of the War is Major General Dan Sickles. So imagine this. You are certainly familiar with Sickles' role at Gettysburg, the forward movement on July the 2nd of the 3rd Corps, which cost Sickles his leg, this severe discord between Meade and Sickles. Sickles has an opportunity here in his testimony to really damage Meade's reputation. And he will emphasize less the pursuit. Sickles focuses more on the fact in his mind, his argument that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. And if you look through his testimony, he will argue that Dan Sickles, had to beg General Meade to move the Army of the Potomac from Maryland up into Pennsylvania to concentrate all 7 infantry corps at Gettysburg, that Sickles begged Meade to offer battle at Gettysburg. And then he will really emphasize in his testimony the role of the 3rd Corps and how imperative it was for him to move his 9,000 some men forward on July the 2nd to assume that what he calls, quote, commanding ground. You all probably know this, how Sickles reimagines what happens on July the 2nd and really privileges his generalship in a way in which he casts it to basically save the Army of the Potomac on July the 2nd through his brilliant move forward into places like the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den. Sickles is going to be the first voice that these congressmen, these senators hear. He's really going to set the stage for what's to come. Now, at this time in February of 1864, Sickles is not with the Army of the Potomac. He will ask to be reinstated to field command. He wants his 3rd Corps command back, and he will actually move or travel down to Fairfax, Virginia, and he meets with Meade on October the 18th. And he asks if Meade will reinstate him as 3rd Corps commander. Meade, of course, says no. He says that Sickles is not well enough and he's not healthy enough to command a corps in the field. So Sickles knows that as long as Meade is in command of the Army of the Potomac, he is not going to have a field command. So in the course of his testimony, then, Sickles really works to craft up Hooker. He really works to reimagine the Battle of Chancellorsville in a way that shows Hooker's strengths. And I'm going to share with you one of those exchanges. A question comes from the Joint Committee. Will you state, in your opinion as a military man, was it not a very rash and hazardous movement to displace the commanding officer of the Army while in the vicinity of the enemy and on the eve of battle, as was the case when General Hooker was relieved? And Sickles will respond, and he says, at the time, I considered it a misfortune to the Army and apprehended that disaster might result from it. We'll see this in a couple places tonight too, but the Joint Committee asks very leading questions. And I know some of you on the PowerPoint, on the Zoom call tonight are lawyers, and you have real practical experience in this in your own work, in your own career. But my goodness, is that a leading question or what? So when I mentioned about these testimonies being so verily orchestrated and crafted, this is a perfect example. I do this as a professor in the classroom too, right? If you want your students to answer a question a particular way, you have to ask the question in a particular way, right? You need to ask the question to get the response that you want. And here they're asking a question that is rehabilitating Joe Hooker at the expense, of course, of George Meade. Sickles' testimony is going to be followed by another very vocal Meade critic, and that is Major General Abner Doubleday. He's the second person to testify before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. Now, Doubleday, as you recall, will start the Gettysburg Campaign commanding a division in the 1st Corps. But on July the 1st, after Reynolds falls mortally wounded, Doubleday will temporarily take command of the 1st Corps, performs by all accounts pretty well on July the 1st. But then Meade will replace Doubleday with John Newton. And this will infuriate Doubleday. When Meade was given command of the Army of the Potomac, he was also given the latitude to promote officers like Newton, regardless of seniority. And this is something that will not sit well with Doubleday. He will return to division command, and then shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, he's going to be shelved and will be in Washington, D.C. So like Sickles, this is someone that very much has a professional axe to grind against the commanding general. I'll mention too that Doubleday is a vocal abolitionist, and his brother commands a unit in the United States Colored Troops. So this is an opportunity to really get at that conservative, democratic officer cadre that permeates the Army of the Potomac. This is an opportunity for these radical Republicans to really poke at that perception. So Doubleday is going to take charge here and accuse Meade, similar to what Sickles did, of not wanting to fight at Gettysburg. Here he says that it is just inexplicable that Meade could hear the thunder of battle all day without riding up from Taneytown to see what was going on. So here's this notion of Meade being lethargic, reluctant to fight at Gettysburg. They'll also push Doubleday on the pursuit. Question: after the repulse of the enemy, were our troops so much exhausted by the 3 days fighting that it was impossible for them to follow up the enemy vigorously? Doubleday replies, I have no idea why they were not pursued. I believe the 6th Corps had not been very actively engaged, at least not so much as the other corps. They were comparatively fresh and could have been thrown upon the enemy. Well, Doubleday's right about the 6th Corps not being very actively engaged. They lose less than 2% casualties during the battle, but that first sentence is just blasphemy. I have no idea why they were not pursued. Of course they were pursued. We talked about that in January. So he's crafting this notion of a lethargic, half-hearted pursuit that other generals are going to continue that thread. They're going to continue that exact argument. And that's going to be the third person to testify. The third person to testify is Brigadier General Albion Howe. And this might seem like a curious choice. Why are they bringing in a kind of obscure division commander to testify to Congress? Albion Howe of the 6th Corps. He is someone like Doubleday and like Sickles, who finds himself without command in the winter of 1863. The previous month, right before he testifies, Meade will transfer Howe out of the Army of the Potomac and put him into the Office of Inspector of Artillery in Washington. So Howe sees this as an opportunity to settle some professional disputes. And the Joint Committee is pleased to have Howe's testimony because he's an officer in the 6th Corps. So the 6th Corps, we learned in January, is really the tip of the spear on the pursuit. And Howe is going to give, for 2 days, he testifies March 3rd and 4th, really the most in-depth discussion that the Joint Committee has heard about the days after the Battle of Gettysburg, leading to the events at Falling Waters and Williamsport. And he will conclude that Meade should have attacked. When Lee had dug in around Williamsport, Meade had an opportunity to attack, and he let that opportunity slip from his hands. He pushes that a little bit further, and he says that there's a want of heart and earnest of purpose in the man who is in command. So very much suggesting that Meade doesn't have the heart, the drive, the motivation, the honor, the courage, however you want to describe it, to push the Confederates and really see this war to its ultimate conclusion. So Howe will craft some of these canards about the pursuit, about it being slow, about the pace being languid, missed opportunities along the Potomac, in a way in which we still live with 160 years later. All these mischaracterizations, they're spinning these webs now. And Howe's also one that's going to give the radical Republicans on the committee particularly kind of an account of what they want to hear. The questions asked to Howe: take the other division, take the other officers, commanders of divisions, brigades, and the colonels. Do they retain full confidence in the ability of the commanding general? So very carefully crafted question. And Howe says, I do not think that they have the full confidence in the ability or state of mind of General Meade. And he puts a little bit of nuance in. I do not think they have, I will not say confidence, but faith in him. They do not expect from him what the crisis seems to call for. So that first part that I've pulled out from the testimony is really the golden phrase of what the committee wanted to hear. That the men in the Army of the Potomac, the rank and file, and the officer cadre, they lack faith and confidence in the commanding general. That's the golden phrase that they want to hear. So by March 4th, Sickles, Doubleday, and Albion Howe have given the radical Republicans, like Zachariah Chandler, enough ammunition that they go to President Lincoln and ask Lincoln to relieve Meade of command. That's on March the 4th. They present the case from Sickles, Doubleday, and Howe to President Lincoln. They ask for him to relieve Meade of command, and Lincoln, of course, says no. Now, this might be surprising in some ways because Lincoln has had no qualms in the past of relieving officers of command, McClellan, Burnside, and Hooker, but he does not find the case compelling enough. Certainly the stakes of the victor of Gettysburg, imagine that what they're offering here is just not convincing enough. So the radical Republicans like Wade and Howe will go back and they'll continue to call in more witnesses. They'll continue to call in more witnesses. As this is going on, this is March 4th, George Meade will arrive in Washington, D.C. He arrives on the 4th. He's visiting D.C., comes up from Brandy Station to talk with the Lincoln administration about the reorganization of the Army of the Potomac. He's talking about this impending reorganization. Meade knows nothing about the Joint Committee hearings until he gets to D.C. And when he arrives and he's walking around the streets of Washington, he hears people just constantly gossiping and talking about what's going on in the halls of Congress. And he writes to Margaret on March the 6th, 2 days after he gets there. He says, the streets and the bar rooms are all agog with the news. And he's hearing that some of his officers are testifying to Congress about him and about his leadership. And he calls these, in that same letter, grave charges. So Meade, since he's in DC, has an opportunity to defend himself. And he will go before the Joint Committee on March the 5th. Meade ultimately testifies to the committee 3 times. March the 5th is the first time, then he comes back about a week later on the 11th, testifies again, and then he'll come back on April 4th for his 3rd testimony. The first and the second one are really the most interesting. The one on March the 5th, Meade testifies to Congress for about 3 hours, and he wasn't expecting to testify to Congress, so he doesn't have anything prepared. He doesn't have any of his reports. He doesn't have copies of any of his orders. He will go in and testify kind of off the cuff, extemporaneous, for 3 hours. And it's really remarkable how well he does, and with such detail that he recalls the specifics of the Gettysburg Campaign without notes to rely on, or without these orders to rely on. So in he goes, kind of into the lion's den or the devil's den. And he's going to take those big charges, didn't want to fight at Gettysburg, didn't pursue, and he's going to defend himself. He's going to defend himself. He will give plenty of evidence, certainly compelling evidence, that he did intend to fight at Gettysburg. And what Sickles is saying and what Doubleday is saying is absolutely a mischaracterization. He will say that he never gave an order to retreat. This is something that really Doubleday and Butterfield particularly are going to emphasize, that Meade had this order to retreat from Gettysburg in place and was ready to implement it. Meade says there was no such order. Why would I put the Army of the Potomac, move them to Gettysburg on July the 1st to turn around then and order them to retreat? That, he says, is entirely incomprehensible. He's really going to have to explain the Pipe Creek Circular. he's really going to have to explain that as a contingency plan, because people like Sickles and people like Doubleday have characterized the Pipe Creek Circular in a way that it emphasizes that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. He has to explain that as a fallback plan. It's a contingency plan. It's a line laid out that if everything goes completely bad for the Army of the Potomac, my corps can fall back to these prescribed designated positions and hold a line along Pipe Creek in Maryland. Meade is really going to have to defend his use of councils of war. I talked with you about this in January, but this is a huge point of contention to the Joint Committee. Councils of war, to some, look weak. They look like Meade is not prepared to act on his own authority, and that he wants to solicit input from his subordinates about what the Army should do. And the one council that gets a lot of discussion among these witnesses is the Council of War on July the 2nd. And this council, this is at the Leicester House, it's what we're looking at in the image, the Gardner image, on the night of July the 2nd, is characterized by Meade critics as being where Meade intended to tell his subordinates that he was going to withdraw from Gettysburg. This is wrapped into this order that Meade supposedly wrote to retreat, and that he was bringing his corps commanders to the Leicester House to tell them to prepare to retreat or withdraw from Gettysburg. This is an interpretation of the Council of War that's still pretty popular among some Meade critics today, including historians who have written on this topic. But fortunately, Meade, we have the evidence, writes to Halleck at 8 o'clock on July the 2nd, and he very explicitly says, I shall remain in my present position tomorrow, but I'm not prepared to say whether that will be an offensive nature or a defensive nature. So for the critics who say that Meade convened his Council of War, it lasts 3-some hours, intending to withdraw, Meade can point to that message to Halleck at 8 o'clock. And this is particularly Dan Butterfield's testimony on this, the July 2nd Council of War, is really damaging. He says that Meade had ordered him to prepare in order to withdraw from Gettysburg. When it was going to be used is sort of a matter of debate. But we also know Butterfield is the one that recorded the questions and the minutes from that Council of War on the night of July the 2nd. So when Butterfield testifies, this is really going to make Meade anxious about how in what ways it's being mischaracterized, what that Council of War was intended to be, and how disingenuous Butterfield is in talking about the Council of War to the Joint Committee. In regards to the pursuit, Meade is going to take this and work to defend himself, that he in fact did pursue from Gettysburg to the best of the condition of the Army of the Potomac would allow. Other people like John Sedgwick, I'll show you in a second, will support Meade's actions in that 10-day pursuit. He will have to defend the use of a Council of War at Falling Waters on July the 12th. Meade says that these are consultations. He doesn't call them councils of war, he calls them consultations. And he justifies when the congressmen like poke at him, why are you calling so many of these councils of war? Meade justifies and he says he's so new to command. He's so new to command that he didn't feel the authority of making the decisions without gaining input and advice from his subordinates. So these consultations are an opportunity for him to gather information from his corps commanders, understand the situation that lies before him better, then make a decision. So he refutes the accusation that these councils of war show weakness or cautious leadership. The part of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War with the Pursuit is really interesting in the way in which different eyewitnesses emphasize different parts of the pursuit. Now, some people who are generally favorable to Meade in their testimony criticize him on the pursuit. And one such person is Gouverneur K. Warren. When Warren is called to testify, he says that Meade, in fact, should have attacked the Confederate line along the Potomac River. James Wadsworth, Albion Howe, we've already talked about. David Bell Birney is very critical of Meade during the pursuit. Wadsworth says, now, of course, this is in retrospect, he says they should have attacked. The Army of the Potomac should have attacked. The question is asked to James Wadsworth, a vigorous attack on our side with our army in good spirits, as you say they were, must have been destructive to Lee's army under any circumstance. Wadsworth says, I believe almost everybody in the army admits that now. Wadsworth will be at that July 2nd Council of War in place of John Newton, who was sick, to represent the First Corps. The support for Meade during the pursuit come from people like John Sedgwick. Now, Sedgwick, of course, is an authority because it's the 6th Corps that will be the tip of the spear in the pursuit. And when Sedgwick testifies on April the 8th, he said it would have been very advantageous to have attacked him, Lee, while he was withdrawing, but not when he was in position there. I believe if we had attacked him, we would have received a severe repulse. Sedgwick's testimony, of course, carries tremendous weight as the commander of the 6th Corps. So these 15 officers are parading in and out February, March, into early April. And I'm going to make just a tiny detour for a minute and check the time. A tiny detour to overlay other things that are going on for Meade and within the Army of the Potomac at the exact same time. So let's put some layers to the Joint Committee. Let's add a little bit of texture or nuance. The Second Battle of Gettysburg is in full steam. This is the debates about the Battle of Gettysburg playing out in the newspaper. Meade's star certainly its highest of highs come July 5th, 6th, and then we'll get to the lowest of lows with frustrations about the pursuit, supposed missed opportunities come mid-July as Lee escapes back into Virginia. Meade writes about how all this is playing out in the newspaper on December the 7th with an often quoted letter to his wife, Margaretta, and he says, I see the Herald is constantly harping on the assertion that Gettysburg was fought by corps commanders and the common soldier, and that no generalship was displayed at all. I suppose after a while, it will be discovered I was not at Gettysburg at all. Of course, the newspapers are battlegrounds for reputation. Of course, the newspapers are places where reputations and images and public opinion is being shaped. And there's a very favorable account of Meade's generalship that will be published in a newspaper in New York called the Round Table on March the 12th. And it's an editorial titled, Ought General Meade Be Removed? And the answer to that, according to this writer, is no. And he says, we have changed commanders too often. With the exception of General Meade, each change has been for the worse. And in the course of this editorial, this person will amplify all of Meade's strengths and encourage people to recognize that the right man is in command of the Army of the Potomac. Unfortunately, that roundtable article is published at the same time the Historicus account is published in the New York Herald. Now, we could do an entire roundtable discussion on the Meade-Sickles controversy. That's certainly worth its own hour. But this is going on at the same time the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War and the testimonies are unfolding in Washington. Largely presumed to be written by Dan Sickles. This is a very long-winded diatribe about the Third Corps and the role that it played at the Battle of Gettysburg, published under the pseudonym Historicus. Meade certainly expects that this is Sickles, and it is Sickles at work, and he will ask Halleck to redress this in some way, and he doesn't receive any kind of friendly or empathetic ear from Halleck, but this adds to the turmoil in Washington. And it kicks off a very furious debate in the newspapers about Meade's leadership. James Barnes, commander in the Fifth Corps, will offer a rebuttal. Various other officers and common soldiers will offer rebuttals to what Historicus is claiming. And Meade's reputation is being discussed. It's largely being debated here in newspapers for consumption, and absolutely shapes his image and impacts how we remember him today. Certainly this all weighs a lot on Meade, very much weighs on him. And he writes to his wife on the 16th, "I do not believe in the policy of keeping perfectly silent and allowing your enemies to poison the public mind without making some effort to place the truth before them. This is all I intend to do." Meade cares very deeply about his reputation. He is a voracious reader of newspapers, and he very much cares about what's being said about him in the newspaper. So he follows, of course, this Historicus account. He follows the Second Battle of Gettysburg being played out in the newspaper, and he looks for ways to set the record straight. But the fact that so much of his leadership is still contested today suggests that the Second Battle of Gettysburg and people like Sickles and Historicus were successful in crafting a particular image of the commanding general. So I have a few points, and I see the chat box kind of amping up here, so I'll be anxious to see what your questions are. I have a few points yet about how this wraps up. It's really an anticlimactic end in many ways. I want to remind you that as the Joint Committee hearings are going on, Ulysses S. Grant has been promoted to Lieutenant General. That rank has been revived by Congress. The first person and the last person to hold the rank of Lieutenant General, of course, is George Washington. And Grant will be coming east. He will meet with Abraham Lincoln on March the 4th, initially intending to go back west to manage the war in the armies out there, but will change his mind. And as we know, will make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac. And on March the 10th, Grant will meet Meade at Army of the Potomac headquarters at Brandy Station. In a little perhaps known or overshadowed or passed over moment of that meeting on the 10th is that Grant brings with him Major General William Baldy Smith. And it suggests that Grant had intended, was considering replacing Meade with Baldy Smith. Smith, of course, is no stranger to the Army of the Potomac. Then he's going to be sent to the Western Theater and becomes a bit of a Grant crony, if you will. He redeems his reputation a bit. And here he is meeting with Meade on the 10th. Now, Smith is not campaigning to take command of the Army of the Potomac, but it surely makes Meade anxious. And Meade will write a lot about what the presence of Baldy Smith here at this meeting meant. Meade certainly realizes that his job is on the line. The newspapers are constantly speculating that he's going to be shelved, replaced with someone like Smith. Alfred Pleasanton, as his name is circulated, any number of people, and Meade is reading all this and is just constantly fretting about his security. This quote is something that Baldy Smith recounts that supposedly Secretary Stanton said to Grant. General Grant, you're going to the Army of the Potomac and you will find a very weak and irresolute man there. And my advice to you is that you make a change at once. Wow. Baldy Smith and George Meade have a long history together, and it is one that is not friendly on either side. So put yourself in George Meade's shoes. There is so much going on in the early weeks and months of 1864, right on the eve, right on the outset of the Overland Campaign. Meade testifies the third and final time on April the 4th, and the way in which the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War investigation comes to an end is quite anticlimactic. It is quite anticlimactic. The cabal will basically go out with a whimper. And you can read any number of Union soldier accounts, officers and from the rank and file, and they're very aware about what's going on in Washington. Charles Wainwright, familiar no doubt with his published diary of battle, writes on the 6th that Sickles and Doubleday are responsible for this, and he calls them rascality and stupidity. General Webb, here in my image, says the fool has overreached himself, referring to Dan Sickles. So the Joint Committee goes out with a whimper. But one thing that will improve for the Army of the Potomac, a very politically volatile army, is that the reorganization allows Meade to get rid of many of these agitators, either through the reorganization itself and consolidating to the core, or just flat out shelving them or transitioning them somewhere else. So Alfred Pleasanton, who was no friend to Meade in his testimony, is of course going to be replaced by Phil Sheridan. Any other number of people are going to be replaced. Sickles, of course, never comes back. Butterfield is going to go west with Hooker. Doubleday is not going to come back to the Army of the Potomac. So these kind of toxic anti-Meade generals by the start of the Overland Campaign are no longer with the Army of the Potomac. And frankly, think about how that helps or aids Grant's ability to manage that army. All that discontent and that political volatility that we see really when the war begins, reaches its crescendo under McClellan, and then really permeates into Meade's tenure too, is now absent or silenced because the reorganization and deliberate shelving of those malcontents has created a more stable, at least politically stable army. So I'll leave you with this thought. The Joint Committee, as I said, goes out with a whimper. It goes out with a whimper. The official report on Meade's leadership will not be published until May of 1865. May 22nd, the report is released. And by this point, at least Appomattox is 6 months ago. The Civil War is over in the Eastern Theater, at least, and it is nothing more than political theater, right? Grandstanding, political dog and pony show. They were not able to accomplish their goal in removing Meade of command. Whether or not you think that they were successful in smearing or tarnishing Meade's reputation, there's certainly a case to be made for that. And we can see the legacies of that today in 2023. So I'll leave you a quote with Theodore Lyman, who joins Meade's staff in the fall of '63. And he says about how sensitive or touchy Meade is to his reputation. On April the 2nd, he says, "The old general is a little more chary of his reputation than he was, and a shade more vain." So I'm hopeful that that gives you a little bit of nuance on this civil-military relation and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. I will stop my PowerPoint, I'll stop screen share, and I'll come over and join you guys and see what questions you all have for me and look through some of the comments and questions in the chat.
Great presentation, Professor Murray. And as you would expect, there are a lot of questions on this. It was a great presentation. Rich, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to start off in the beginning. Henry, you cut me off. I didn't introduce Professor Murray, so let me give you the introduction at the end. By the way, that was just a phenomenal presentation. God knows how many I've heard, but that was, you are so invited back. You have no idea. And when your book comes out, I can't wait. Dr. Jennifer Murray is a military historian with a specialization in the American Civil War in the Department of History at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Murray's recent publication is on a great battlefield, the making and management and memory of Gettysburg National Military Park, published by the University of Tennessee. She's also the author of Civil War Begins, published by the U.S. Army Center of Military History. He is currently working on a full-length biography of General Gordon and George Meade. Okay. In addition to delivering hundreds of Civil War battlefield tours, that got to be a phenomenal tour that you're giving. I give my sides, I can't help it. Murray has led World War I and World War II study abroad trips to Europe. She's a veteran faculty member at Gettysburg College's Civil War Institute and a coveted speaker at the Civil War symposiums and roundtables. Additionally, Murray worked as a seasonal interpretive park ranger for the National Park Service at Gettysburg National Military Park for 9 years. I got to ask you one question before, and it sounds odd, and I point blank, it's really a compliment. The building you work in is the Murray Building. Is that named after you? No, I'm dead serious.
Yeah. So good to make that connection. No, it's not. It's named after a governor of Oklahoma. Murray evidently is a kind of a famous name in Oklahoma. Of course, I'm not from Oklahoma. I'm from Pennsylvania and Maryland. But when I took the job and saw that the history department was housed in the Murray Building, I thought this is quite the coincidence, isn't it? Or maybe a good sign for me to do good stuff here at Oklahoma State.
That was an ultimate compliment I'm paying. I wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
That was not gratuitous. When you hear a lecture like this, you go, why not? You got to see the chat. You have to,
Yeah.
you have to see the chat.
Rich,
I'll leave it on to you.
Yeah, Rich, Ken has been raising his hand. So Ken, you're unmuted. Please ask your
yes,
question.
I am. Yes. Dr. Murray, great talk. I wish you had been a lecturer at the War College Air Force War College, when I was there with Henry Hetzel back in '98. But my comment or my comment is I happen to have an original copy of the very same conduct of the war that you quoted from. And what struck me was very interesting in the testimony of General Howe was that he talked about the action on July 3rd, Pickett's charge, and he said that as far he did not consider the action to be of great military affair as a battle. And also that there was, as a military operation on our side, no particular credit can attach to it. And he also said that that when the fighting was over, our troops were by no means exhausted and that they were comparatively fresh. And later on, he happened to come across a captured lieutenant from the Confederate Army. And that same prisoner had stated to General Howe that the rebel army, that they had but 2 rounds of ammunition with the rear guard. So there was plenty of indication that the rebels were not probably able to counter an attack. So he reported this to General Sedgwick. And the interesting thing was that Sedgwick said that we don't want to bring on a general engagement. So don't come into contact with the enemy. So there must have been some indication from the higher up command to not bring on a general engagement with the retreating rebels. So I was, you know, that was, I was wondering if that was a general impression, you know, throughout the Union Army that participated in pick charge, because I thought that was kind of interesting that they didn't think of it as much of a battle.
Yeah, so a couple things on on that, and I see someone in the chat. Was it maybe it was Art, maybe it was you. You mentioned the Union General Speak book, the Bill Hyde account. Bill Hyde has taken the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War testimony and has went through it sort of line by line, or at least paragraph by paragraph, and has added historical perspective to it. What these people are saying, is it true? Is it embellished? Is it accurate? Is it not? And I really like Hyde's account on that, because you can look at this testimony in the original, like you have in your hand, and you can read through it and maybe just take at face value that what they're saying is true. How, as many of these people are certainly exaggerating, deliberately mischaracterizing, embellishing particular parts of their testimony to support a particular case. And I think the Hyde account does a great job in giving us that perspective.
Do you think he was playing into the?
Wait,
hands of the
Ken, let
radical
other people, we've got a lot of questions on, let
Okay.
other people do it.
Okay, all right. Okay, thank
Henry,
you.
you want to run it, or
Sure.
Professor Murray?
One of the first ones we had was, do you think that Meade did Doubleday a disservice at Gettysburg?
Yeah, Brian, thanks for that comment. And Ken, thanks for your comment too about how. I appreciate that. I appreciate your comment. By and large, and maybe you disagree, but Doubleday by and large does a good job on July the 1st with the situation that he's in, the situation that the 1st Corps and the 11th Corps is in on July the 1st. I think that Doubleday does a good job. I think he does. Now, he and Meade are going to have some longstanding animus. And interestingly, Doubleday, after Meade dies, will write, I think it's in the New York Times, sort of a postscript to his account and his testimony in the Joint Committee, where he kind of apologizes for how he slandered Meade so poorly here in the winter of 1864. And he said he admits that some things that he said were mischaracterized and very much shaped by his bitterness about being shelved for July the 1st and being replaced by Newton. So short answer, yes. And second follow-up is Doubleday's sort of recognizes how that influenced him in his testimony to Congress, which I think is a fantastic kind of actualization. Too bad Meade didn't live to see it.
Another question from Brian, and we have lots of questions, over 20 questions. So I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we'll give it a try. And I think, Professor, you're always open for people posing questions directly to you also. But how much, if any, is Edward Stanton involved in the anti-Meade sentiment?
That's a good question. Stanton is definitely annoyed with Meade about the McClellan testimonial. There's pretty conclusive evidence that Stanton is irate that Meade has supported this political electioneering for McClellan. And that sets a bad taste in his mouth. The question maybe too about like Stanton and his role in the reorganization of the Army, and how the reorganization of the Army and the latitude that Meade has to shelve some generals that are antagonistic to him is a great question that we don't have 100% conclusive evidence in what role Stanton played, what authority Meade had, because there are some people like George Sykes that Meade wishes that he could keep, but they get cashiered from the Army. Is that Stanton's doing? On what influence does he have? So that to say, Stanton at different times is supportive of Meade in different ways, but then also sees some frustration with Meade and maybe overreaching or stepping a little bit more into these political waters than what he thinks Meade should. That's a great question, though.
Well, Henry, before we get started, I just wanted to point
ahead.
out, thanks to Judge Harper, Professor Murray, a former Supreme Court Justice from New Jersey, Stuart Pollock, is watching this program, and we welcome you.
So
Okay, Henry, you're
another
back.
good question, Professor Murray, from AH. Did any other general face the same degree of hostility after the Joint Commission that Meade experienced?
I think what sets Meade apart, and we could certainly think of like Fitzjohn Porter. And if you're familiar with Bill Marvel has that new biography out on Fitzjohn Porter, I think came out a couple years ago, and he's kind of resurrecting or maybe redeeming Fitzjohn Porter for his actions in the summer of '62. I think what sets Meade apart, though, is that Meade is defending his victory. And I'm willing to hear maybe kind of pushback on this, but I can't think of another scenario in American history that's different. And even if you want to move forward in the 20th century and the way in which the Army McCarthy hearings or Douglas MacArthur is sort of involved in politics, I can't quite see that as analogous. So I would say Meade's case is the exception, and it's exceptional because he's brought in to defend success. And we can quibble and argue, and we do, this is the joy of this, about the pursuit from Gettysburg. But you can't argue with the fact that the Army of the Potomac defeated Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. And under Meade's leadership, the Army of the Potomac achieved its first significant victory to date. And now Meade is going to be testifying to Congress about his success. I can't think of anything that's comparable to that. I cannot think of anything that's comparable to that.
Another good question from Abigail is, did Lincoln use his influence on what the committee was doing? And was he upset, disturbed, outraged by the discussions?
Yeah, I like that question. And I've not seen any written record about the conversation between Lincoln and Stanton and members of the Joint Committee on March the 4th. I've not seen, they listen to Albion Howe, then they go over and talk to Lincoln literally after Howe's walked out on March the 4th after his testimony. They move right to go to Lincoln with this evidence to get Meade relieved. I've never seen any primary source that tells us what was said in that meeting. I've not seen record of that. So we speculate, because Meade's not relieved of command, of course, that Lincoln pushes back and he says it's not enough. You haven't presented enough for me to relieve the victor of Gettysburg. What's kind of curious about that, and if you think of like Lincoln's meddling in political affairs, Lincoln's military affairs, Lincoln's constantly meddling in military affairs. And he does it in a way that he allows like back channel ways to get to him. John Newton, for instance, after the Battle of Fredericksburg, will be up in Washington, D.C., John Newton saying that Burnside should be relieved of command. So Lincoln entertains or allows for this backstabbing, like divisiveness in the Army of the Potomac by allowing someone like Newton to have an opportunity to air his grievances with him. There's going to be some good work coming out on Lincoln as commander-in-chief. And in fact, my dissertation director, Ken No, is working on a book on Lincoln as commander-in-chief. And I think it's going to give us a little more nuance to how Lincoln contributes, frankly, to a lot of this dysfunction in the Army of the Potomac. And I certainly think that's true with Meade. Here at the Joint Committee and also in the fall of 1863, and Meade's floundering in these operations down through Central Virginia. That's a great question. And Lincoln absolutely has a role, and we need to understand what that role is and how it contributes to this dysfunction.
Again, we have so many questions. I'm going to ask one or two more, but Ted has a good question about Meade's personality. It was known that he was a very difficult person. And did that, color his staff's views of him?
That's a great question. And man, we could go on some anecdotes about that. Yeah, we get this notion that Meade is volatile, that he's the snapping turtle is what he comes down to in history. That, by the way, that old goggle-eyed snapping turtle comes from Horace Porter, and it's a secondhand account. I have never seen any primary account during the war of a soldier calling Meade a goggle-eyed snapping turtle. That's secondary, and it's post-war. But they call him plenty of things. They call him Old Four Eyes. They call him Old Granny. His soldiers write these epitaphs about him during the war. But there are many accounts of Meade losing his temper. He loses his temper with Birney at Fredericksburg. Lyman writes a lot about how irascible Meade is. It seems to me like he's really like a volcano, like he explodes really quickly and then sort of simmers back down. He explodes with Phil Sheridan in May of '64, very famously at Mount Carmel Church, this big engagement with Sheridan right during the Overland Campaign. Really vitriolic words exchanged, but then Meade goes over, puts his hand on Sheridan and apologizes to him. So no doubt Meade's temperament is a factor, but so many of these men are kind of wired similarly, right? They are similarly temperamental. But whether or not we think it contributes negatively to his command and his leadership, I think is a different question. And I personally would say no to that.
One
Henry,
last question.
Well, okay, take a last question, then I'll.
One last question,
Okay.
which I think is interesting. Did the Republican senators continue to push Hooker as commander before the election of 1864?
So when Hooker goes west in September with the 11th and 12th Corps, that sort of resolves that situation. It resolves it for Hooker. He sees like he's kind of content with that. And Hooker redeems himself out west in some ways. He's content with that. Meade is happy. He's relieved that he doesn't have to have Hooker maybe inserted or reinserted back into the Army of the Potomac. So come September with 11th and 12th Corps going west, that really wraps that up. Now, they could have brought him from the west east, but by the time that is in place, that's sort of resolved that question.
And
All
one
right.
last one, a number of people were asking about your book and when is that going to be available?
So I'm working, and I maybe mentioned this in January too, working on it. I'm actually in the Overland Campaign now. I just wrote a chapter on Meade at Cold Harbor. So it's June of '64 in my book. I've got some 15 chapters written, and of course the Overland Campaign to finish, move into Petersburg. I suspect I'll be writing still through the end of the year. Meade's role in Reconstruction is pretty short, and he dies in 1872. So once I get through Appomattox, the rest of the book will come a lot quicker. But the end is in sight. I assure you, I'm steadily, I really truly mean this. I appreciate your enthusiasm and looking forward to the book. That really inspires and motivates me to know that I have an audience ready to read it. And I hope that it lives up to its expectations for sure.
Yeah, but otherwise you had great accolades. The only complaint I heard was it went too fast. The presentation went too fast.
Yeah, Henry,
And-
let me
and-
just say a few, okay. I just wanted to wrap it up. We have Arthur Crompton on from Australia on this program. So you're all over the world now for the program. Let me just say a few words before, again, we thank you. But our next meeting will be Bruce Tucker, who will do Admiral in first person of Admiral Farragut at Mobile Bay. And I'm looking for Bosun Whistle to pipe him into the meeting. And in May, we have Miley from Seminary Ridge, who'll be talking about Pennsylvania 151st at Gettysburg. Okay. Again, to everybody, thank you for attending, and we'll see you next month on the fourth Thursday.